This is Wendy Halley, and you're listening to Lucid Cafe. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. Today's episode is an eye-opening one, and a topic I've been wanting to explore on this podcast from the beginning. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the destructive dynamics of being in a cult. When we typically think about cults, we usually think about extreme religious movements like Heaven's Gate, the People's Temple led by the infamous Jim Jones, or the Unification Church, whose members are referred to as the Moonies. But my guest, Gerette Buglion, invites us to broaden our understanding of cult involvement and to know that any one of us, at any point, can fall prey to a strong, usually charismatic leader whose controlling yet crazy subtle techniques can slip by you without your conscious awareness. Next thing you know, you're in deep. In Gerette's new memoir, An Everyday Cult, and in today's episode, she shares a startling and honest account of her 18-year experience in a group that, on its face, was about exploring your dreams in order to grow as a person. Doesn't sound horrible, right? And then the realization that led her to leave the group and become a cult awareness educator. Please enjoy my conversation with Gerette Buglion. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with me.
It's a pleasure. Really a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, you too. As I mentioned before we started recording, I had heard about your new book and was very intrigued and went out and I bought the ebook version of it and ripped through it. It's a very personal memoir of your experience in a cult. And I love the title of your book, An Everyday Cult, because I want to get your take on the title, but I think it suggests a broader concern for any of us.
Indeed. I appreciate that you got that out of the title. Thanks, Wendy. What happened for me was when I snapped out of the group that I was a part of for 18 years and started looking at what cultic involvement was and what indoctrination looks like, how it happens. I was really interested to kind of see that what I thought was a cult previously had major similarities to what I experienced, but also major differences. Like I was not required to wear white flowing robes, or I did not have to sell flowers on the street corners. I did not have to move to some remote place and devote all of my earnings to, the guru. And yet there were so many things that were similar, and I couldn't deny that. So it was really as I dug deeper and deeper into what cultic dynamics are, what is behind them, I realized that, I think part of what's happened is that kind of cliche idea that we had of what a cult is has perhaps purposefully gone underground, and yet the dynamics that perpetuate the cultic involvement are very much alive in the world today, and in fact, perhaps even more so now than ever before. And I say that having written my book during the rise of President Trump and his 4-year term. I say that not as a political statement. I say that as a statement about what cultic involvement looks like and the techniques that cult leaders use. One of my early articles was actually called Thank You, Donald. So I'm in a blog post, not an article. And what I did is I took a list of 50 traits of a dangerous cult leader and looked at, Donald Trump and could check off every single one of those traits. And I, who had already started to do a little bit of work around cult recovery and education, I had this naive idea that Donald Trump coming out into the open and flaunting cultic techniques was going to help the world, help all of us Americans to wake up to the fact to what cultic dynamics were, and we would all be able to kind of call the emperor as naked. But as we know all too well, that didn't happen.
Right.
Kind of far
Exactly.
from
Yeah,
it.
yeah, but it was a lovely wish to have.
Oh, I know. That's me and my innocence, and also just part of who I am. I am, believe it or not, I am an eternal optimist, even though I do now possess a level of, healthy skepticism that I think is important.
Absolutely, it's important. I want to dive into the aspects of a cult in general and things that we should look out for. But first, I'd really like to hear a little bit about your story. Just if you don't mind giving an overview of how you ended up in this everyday cult.
Yeah, sure. My involvement with the group I was a part of for 18 years started out of in innocently witnessing a couple friends of mine who had started working with this teacher. I call him Doug in my book. And I saw in them a kind of lightness of being. I saw them shift. I saw that they were enjoying life in a new way. And I had spent many years as a teacher in a Waldorf school, and there was a kind of heaviness, to my life. As a teacher, I felt a lot of responsibility, and I had just become a new mom. And so I had a particular vulnerability because of that as well. And I guess I'll just, as a side note, many people who do get involved in cultic groups do so at a vulnerable time in life. Doesn't have to be the case, but it's not uncommon. So I was a new mom and just wanting more levity in my life. And I knew that they were working with this guy. They talked about exploring their dreams, and it was intriguing. And so when my daughter was 6 months old, I said, okay, she's old enough now. I'm going to have my first go at it. And from the very first session with Doug, I felt like there was like this new way of looking at life. There were aspects of that very first session that really moved me on a deep level, that were quite profound. And I describe that in kind of greater detail in my book. But I felt this potential. I felt like, oh, wow, isn't that cool to have a whole new way of looking at life? And it was refreshing after the, almost 2 decades of working as a Waldorf teacher, where I don't know if you've been around, anthroposophy is the spiritual foundation for Waldorf education. And anthroposophy can be kind of heavy. There's a kind of heaviness to it, even though the pedagogy of the education has a lot of beauty and joy and lightness to it. But that's a whole nother conversation. So I think because I had been so deeply involved as a teacher, there was something really exciting for me about this new orientation to life. And, my first 5 years or so were really pretty, kind of lighthearted exploration that really resonated, and it worked, and it wasn't until after maybe that 5 or 6 years that things started to get more entrenched, and then progressively more so as the years went on.
That shift, Do you think that was a shift in you, or was it a shift in the actual group?
Both. Well, no. I think that it was actually a shift that was taking place. In all honesty, I think it very well could have been that the teacher, the head teacher, Doug, was becoming more and more full of himself. Yes, exactly. You couldn't see this, but Wendy just made a gesture of getting bigger. I think that ego was getting bigger as he was getting more and more clients. He was teaching, he had a class that he was teaching. More and more people were coming to the class. There was kind of this like growing interest. And I think that started to feed that change. In my case, things got a little more intense actually when I moved away, because my husband and I, and again, I kind of go into this in more detail in the book, but we had a personal kind of long time yearning to know whether or not intentional community living was something that we really wanted, whether that was something that would really nourish us as a family. So I have a second child. So my daughter was born, and then I had another child born. And when my son was 3, we actually moved to an intentional community. And that, the plot thickened in a certain way for us personally at that point, but also during that time, the organization around this particular, what we call the work, the organization started to really form. So that started forming while we had moved away. But we were also told that it was kind of a really cool thing that we were moving away because we could be kind of, they didn't use this term, but missionaries in a way, to expand the reach of the work.
Mm-hmm. Spread the word.
Exactly. Spread the word. And so, we thought it was kind of a cool thing that it would work, and moving away didn't work, came back. But when we came back as a family, that was the point, Wendy, where the plot thickened really intensely for me on a personal level, because I had invested so much at that point. I had invested so much time, so much money, so much of my heart and soul space that it needed to work. I needed to make sure that it worked. So that when I moved back, I was diving in fully. And that's when I think I was really the hooks were in earlier.
I wanted to ask about the hooks, if you felt like they were set in those first 5 years, do you think, and looking back, maybe unknowingly? And then as the movement became more serious and formalized,
It changed.
yeah.
And it deepened, and yet the hooks literally started with the very first session, with Doug, where there were twistings of my psyche, and that included the fact that I needed to have outside help in order to best understand my own dreams and my own internal growth.
And Doug was providing those answers, right? He wasn't promoting that you find them, he was providing them for you, correct?
Well, that can be a really subtle thing, Wendy. I certainly at the time believed that he was helping to shine a light so that I could see new things about myself. And yet, so in that way, like, was he actually dictating that I do this or do that or think of it this way? Not explicitly. That's part of the subtlety of those hooks or of the indoctrination process. Indoctrination, starts in the first step. We often talk about it is called love bombing, where there is this kind of oh, there's so much good here. And the fact that my friends were doing it, I got to connect with them about what they were learning. And that created this kind of loving container of excitement. That is a beautiful thing. Like, who's to say there's anything wrong with that? Except for the subtlety. It's only in retrospect, Wendy, that I can see that seeds of dependence were being planted at day one. And in that way, that's something that I feel really sensitive to now, because I'm an educator and I can have people look at me in the same way and be dependent on me. So that cycle is something that I think takes kind of constant vigilance and, I don't know, vigilance, like awareness.
I mean, to take a little side trip here, what have you determined as far as being a healthy dependence versus an unhealthy dependence?
Yeah.
Because as a teacher, you have information that your student doesn't have, and that's the nature of those roles, right? So when is it dysfunctional, do you think, in your eyes, in your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that, especially coming from you, where you have people coming to you all the time, I'm sure, wanting new perspective, wanting insight into their own life. Like that's why people come for any kind of healing work.
Right. And it makes me very uncomfortable at times, I have to say.
Yeah. Well, that discomfort's a really good thing. I think when it becomes a real problem in the teacher, just to use the word teacher, it could be, we could use lots of different terms.
Right.
But in the teacher, the dependence becomes unhealthy when the teacher truly believes that they know something about their client or their student that their student does not have access to. So wherever there's that imbalance, to me, that's the red flag. And that becomes a place, wherever that exists, it doesn't have to happen, but there's the potential for either the cultivation of dependence that grows and grows and grows to the point of harm being done, as happened in my case, or it's, like it can be sometimes teachers just simply have insight because they're older and wiser. And yet my challenge for anyone who's a teacher or in any level of authority is, how do you, like, what do you do with that information? How do you handle it? And I struggle with that in my work, as in addition to being doing work in cult education and recovery, I'm also a Reiki practitioner and teacher. And the way that I've come to find peace in my own self around that is that, my experience of Reiki is my experience. When I'm offering Reiki to someone, they have their experience, and it's their experience that matters. So rather than saying, oh, I felt this weird thing over your right hip, I would bring about a conversation and just check in. And if there's no checking in, there's no checking in. Like, if there's nothing to talk about, that's totally fine. And yet if there is, there can be a little bit of exchange around that. I know that, like, I only do Reiki. It's not that, like, I don't have insight as, for example, a massage therapist or a cranial sacral person, and all, where there are forms of body work that become more and more complex. And I'm sure there's a lot more subtlety and nuance, but I'll just share that as like an example. So for me, the question often becomes, in what ways does the teacher empower the client or student to discover for themselves what's happening and explore for themselves. And in what ways does a teacher get in the way and plant seeds that may or may not be accurate about what's going on in the psyche of a person?
So what can a student or a client who's on the receiving end of this information, what can they look for in themselves, do you think, in order to determine when the teacher or practitioner might be hitting territory that doesn't fit them?
Yeah, it's another great question, Wendy. Like when does information coming from a teacher cross the line? The line of where the autonomy of the receiver, the recipient, is in any way questioned or threatened. And let me just sit with that for a minute. I like the way you phrase that question. What's coming to mind for me is this something that I learned just recently. And this is going to apply to a situation where you might think you might have slightly more nefarious thoughts about a teacher, like kind of wondering, like, are they really at my back? Are you familiar with NLP?
Yes.
And do you?
I have never practiced it or learned it, but
yeah. So NLP is a technique, and I know that there are people who work with NLP who have integrity. And NLP is something that has been used in, just to be clear, it's neuro-linguistic programming. That it's something that has been used in many cultic groups. And in fact, in retrospect, I've started to wonder if my ex-teacher had some level of training or at least basic understanding of it. So in NLP, people are taught to study the movements of their student or client and really take note of, like, yes, what direction are their eyes shifting? Are they looking up to the right or down to the left or back and forth? Is their body shifting to the right, to the left? And they're actually taught to, in a way, mimic these movements. So I guess the NLPer, the one who knows NLP and is trying to help somebody else, quote unquote help, if there's kind of nefarious intent, I just read this great article about NLP where they said, okay, if you want to know if it's being used against you in a manipulative way, test it out. So make a few movements. See if the person you're with mirrors those movements.
Oh, that's so creepy.
Like, I know, it's creepy shit, isn't it?
It's so creepy.
It's really creepy. So you've probably heard of the group Nixium.
Oh,
where
yeah.
women were branded in that horrific.
Keith Renney, or was that his name?
Yeah, Keith Renney is now, in jail for 120 years. This is the best use of jail of all time for him and for people like him who really, there is no safe place in the world other than jail. So that NLP was used big time. Keith Ranieri's number one person was one of the top NLP people supposedly in the country. And so highly advanced, highly sophisticated use of it. And the level of abuse and manipulation that took place in that group was absolutely devastating and horrific. And yet those same techniques can be used. In the group that I was a part of, Wendy, guess what? We got to a point where, I didn't mention this earlier, but there started to be a school for people to learn how to do the work. The school was called Center for Transformational Learning. That's not a real name. I don't use any real names in my book or in any of my communication about my cultic experience. But when the school started happening, we were literally taught to make sure that when we're communicating with a client, that we take note of the phrases that they use and repeat them back, because that will be a way that will kind of gain trust. So here's the thing. We do that naturally in life.
It's reflective listening, right?
It's reflective listening. It's when we are in a place of compassionate relationship with another person, it's perfectly natural.
You just did it right there. I said it's reflective listening, and you said it's reflective listening.
Well, there we go.
Yeah, so we do it naturally. Yeah.
We do it naturally, case in point. And where it becomes potential manipulation is the content that we were working with primarily in the school Center for Transformational Learning was the content of dreams. So when you're talking to someone about their dreams, and you are not only like, yes, you want to hear them talk about their dreams, you want to understand the language, and yes, you want to be a compassionate listener. But we also learned in the same lessons, series of lessons in schools, is that you want to have something. How do they say it? You want to gain turf with your client. And one way that we would literally kind of gain turf was by having certain phrases and certain dream experiences. You can't see this, but I'm actually putting my hand on my back pocket, in your back pocket, so that you can pull that out when they might be resisting learning something new and wonderful and expansive about themselves. They might be resisting it. So then you bring this out, and it will be a kind of a sucker punch for them. So that is a level of where we depart from compassionate listening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it is also very subtle, and I'm wondering too, along those lines, is if, especially in the beginning, like in any relationship, especially romantic relationships,
Mm.
especially ones that don't work, there are those red flags, right? And sometimes you might write it off. You might be aware of something and you might just sort of talk yourself out of it. But other times you're blind to them. And it's not until you have hindsight and you can look back and say, holy shit,
What
there
did
was
I?
this thing and this thing and this thing. And I felt really uncomfortable about this and this and this.
Right.
But for some reason, we weren't able to recognize it at that time. In your experience, could you look back and see that, oh man, there were all these red flags that I either wrote off or was not aware of?
Absolutely. The parallels between what we call actually a one-on-one cult, which is a domestic relationship that has the traits of cultic dynamics. Those parallels are basically seamless. And that there can be a difference between that and, say, a dysfunctional relationship. I'm not in any way saying that dysfunctional relationships, or all of us have levels of dysfunction in our lives.
Are you describing more like a psychological abuse
Yes.
in a relationship?
Right. Where there actually is coercion, where there is gaslighting, where one's reality is being challenged and manipulated to align with whoever the abuser is, be it, the male or female or the other partner, whatever. So there are many parallels, and absolutely I look back and see many a red flag. One of them started literally in my first session where there was, in that particular, my very first session, there was I shared a dream, and there was a man in the dream who my teacher interpreted as the animus, the all-knowing, the wise, the archetypal being that really is here to guide us and support us in our self development. And in my lived experience, this was a dubious man. But the way that Doug, my ex-teacher, interpreted it kind of flipped it around so that he was the good guy. I was the one not trusting myself because, look, I made up this stuff. There's no, like, I made up the fact that there was some abuse happening. That was part of the dream. But there were, no like serious indicators of that happening. Like I didn't see somebody punching somebody or whatever. And yet what happened by him reversing and putting this man on a pedestal in my psyche, I distrusted what I knew, which actually was later confirmed that this particular man was abusing my friend in a very real way. And it's only, it was actually literally only maybe 10 years later that I actually knew that.
How crazy symbolic is all of that?
Right. Crazy symbolic.
Literally, because it's your dream, but also symbolic of your broader experience that started in that first session.
Yes.
Where he's planting the seed of you need to trust the man.
Right.
And you can't trust yourself, so you have to rely on this man as your teacher, as the animus.
Yes.
The one who's going to deliver you.
Which then implies that the one who helped me to see this, who was also a man, is also of animus proportion.
That's exactly where I was going, is that he was planting that seed in a very subtle, unconscious way that I'm your guy.
Exactly.
I'm going to help you out of this.
I've got your back. I've got your back. All, that it is.
Wow, that shit's
so very
deep,
often, it's deep shit, Wendy. Like,
man.
it is like, there's this way, there's a term that we use, a crude term that we use in cult circles called mindfuckery. And that's an example. I don't know, maybe that term is used everywhere else too, but
it's a good term.
Yeah, right. A good term for a tragic violation of human integrity and autonomy.
Right. No, I mean, it sums it up really well.
It sure does. Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get back to something you said a little while ago when you were talking about your experience, and you said that it was kind of like you were describing when you got in really deep.
Yeah.
You described having invested
Yeah.
in this experience or this group. Can you talk about that investment? What did you see your investment as, and why did it have this weight to it?
Right. Yeah. So at that point, I had already been in for over 10 years. I'd already put in a dozen years of my time, my money, what I believed was my growing soul, my growing capacity, what I believed was my growing capacity to know myself so that I could become more and more we would use the word autonomous, autonomous self, and have a relationship with the divine, with God, with the divine world that was filled with true integrity. And the only way you could get there was by going deeper and deeper and deeper into your soul and reckoning with the trauma. So trauma became a really enormous area that was abused in the group that I was in. So the trauma work ramped up at that same time. And that's like a little bit different than what I was saying about the investment. So there was like this synergy between I had invested so much of my time, money, and honestly, like pride. I've been talking about this shit with my friends for over a dozen years, and like, what's the product? Oh, I'll be doing this same work too as a dream guru, and people will be coming to me. And like, that was part of kind of the pyramid scheme. That's another red flag, by the way, wherever there is a hierarchy, like the abuse that takes place in the yoga world, it all takes place primarily up on that higher level where
The guru being on top. Yeah.
yes, the teachers are training with the teachers, and that's where the abuse has taken place.
I think that's probably true in a lot of spiritual traditions,
Absolutely.
whether it's a monotheistic religion or a more alternative spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Certainly is the case in the shamanic world, which is where I hang out.
Yeah.
I mean, not all teachers, but I've certainly heard stories.
Yeah. No matter what the topic, this power over abuse can happen on any layer of society, in all spheres. It can be there. And so just to get back to what I was saying earlier, where you were asking me, I know there's so much to talk about that I can easily get distracted. So you keep me on
So
track.
much,
Right.
yes.
So the combination of how much I had invested, the time, created this kind of horrible dynamic I now see as horrible, because the trauma work had become like the new big thing in the work that we were doing. So we had to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And the only way to become freed from our trauma, and not only was it this life trauma, we also started treading into past life trauma. And there's kind of a whole chapter in my book about that where the leader, my ex-teacher, marries another person, and there's a whole intense drama around past life karmic kind of stuff. And I tell you, that stuff, when you're already idolizing a kind of work, when you have already come to believe a certain amount, then like I had already put Doug on a pedestal. That started to happen from day one, and only became more and more as the years went on. And even though at first maybe it was just a little pedestal, but that pedestal grew. And then when you layer on stuff like learning about past life trauma, the stakes are really high, and you really, really need a guide to help you there. Like, you don't want to tread that shit alone, because you can get lost.
So you can't leave at that point.
That's right. I got to get.
Once you're aware that you have all of this work that needs to be done, you got to stick it out.
Stick it out. And the only way, actually, we used to say this, the only way out is through, that we had to stay and go through all these trauma. We were constantly reliving trauma.
It's actually a good business plan for Doug.
Yeah, works great.
Because
Right.
numerous lifetimes you could do work
There's another one. There's always another layer of
forever.
the onion. There's always another layer of the past life onion to peel, and more money to go into his pocket for more retreats, because or more classes, because there's no end.
And then with that carrot dangling in front of you and your cohort is the promise of autonomy.
The promise of being a true woman of God. That's what I was working for.
Okay.
All, for 18 years.
Right.
Ugh.
All right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So what helped you decide to pack it in?
You mean to get the hell out?
To get the hell out. Yeah.
For me, getting out was really fast. And actually, in some ways, compared to what many, many, many people experience, it was relatively easy. Because what happened in the group that I was a part of, there was this major crisis. And 6 of the higher up teachers, so that, every cult has many layers of hierarchy. You asked earlier about red flags. What can somebody who's just becoming involved, look for? Look for the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is hidden. And don't take just a few broad brushstrokes and think you found it, because you have to go deep. I was involved in what I believed was the decision-making body of the entire organization, the executive committee. And what I now understand is that above executive committee were actually 3 more layers of hierarchy, with Doug being at the top. You could almost call it 4 layers of hierarchy, depending on how you count. So there was a major crisis in the organization. 6 of the teachers who were higher up on that hierarchy left at the same time, literally on the same day. So those 6 teachers had been dealing with stuff that everybody else below them was unaware of. Some people may have been aware of parts of it. And in fact, I know that that was the case. There were people that knew some threads. But because of my nature, which is that of being a deeply loyal person, I would stay in my lane. I would not bother myself about things that the teachers were dealing with, because I knew that they had greater insight than I. And I would always defer and respect them. That was part of the agreement. That was part of the indoctrination process. So when 6 of them left on the same day, it was like a major rupture, a major what the fuck.
Right.
And it was like an earthquake in my life. And the day after this happened, we had a meeting, and that meeting actually took place, believe it or not, without Doug present, even though he would normally be there. But in that meeting, I heard for the very first time one of those teachers describe a level of abuse, of emotional abuse, that was gut-wrenchingly shocking to me because of my relationship with this person and what I knew about her, the way that Doug had treated her. And I knew unequivocally that what she was saying was true. There was no doubt in my mind. And again, it's because of what I know about who she is. And that moment created just a massive cognitive dissonance. And that cognitive dissonance is really what created the gap. And in that gap,
Yeah.
I literally walked out of that room from that meeting. And by the time I got home, my psyche had reorganized in a very significant way, that Doug did not deserve the pedestal that I had put him on. And so for me to get that all at once was huge. For many, many people, that's a long, slow process. That, okay, maybe he deserves that pedestal for this aspect, but not this. Okay, so you kind of navigate smaller bits of cognitive dissonance. But for me, that one huge one took place within a 2-hour period.
Damn, it sounds like somebody dumped a big bucket of ice water on your psyche, right? And it just cracked open.
No, it was actually someone opened up the floodgates, and I could actually see something for truth. I could see reality.
Ah, okay. I was thinking that your world that you thought was intact, all of a sudden,
Was
it just
shattered.
got shattered.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that world. So there was definitely a shattering, but there was also holy shit, the earth is right there. And Doug belongs on the earth, not up on a pedestal.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And I imagine that part of the cult experience is the follower, to use just real
Yep.
basic terms, the follower gives their power away
Right.
because they don't have the knowledge or the wisdom or whatever that the leader has. And so there's a kind of an exchange, I imagine, where you're giving your power to this person because in exchange for the
The good.
keys or the answers
The
or
keys to the
whatever.
kingdom.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet the phrase gives away power can also be,
Well, it's unconscious. I'm not saying it's conscious.
yeah, it's not, it certainly is not conscious. And it also is, like, depending on the situation with whoever is in authority, there is a subtle, I mean, there are so many techniques, Wendy, that very easily usurp someone's power.
So you're saying that it's being taken from them?
It can be more of a taking, absolutely. And in some situations, particularly in, if you're going to look at some of the more big cults that we think of, the Moonies, which is still going big and strong, even though Sun Myung Moon died, there's still plenty intense action going on. Or
Jim Jones
Jim
is a
Jones,
classic example. Yeah.
Jonestown, like there were there were always goods. Jim Jones had some great ideas. He was trying to unite races. He had some really compelling stuff to bring to the table.
Isn't that true with probably most of these leaders? They're offering some
Yes,
really compelling stuff, which is what draws people in. So, or some high ideals or
exactly. And that brings me to something that I don't get to talk about much, Wendy. And I really believe that when we're healing from cultic abuse of any kind or any kind of power over abuse, it can also be relationship or even in the hierarchy of education, of higher education, there can be massive abuse that takes place in the name of academia. Same with governmental groups or all of them. And yet, when we choose to participate with a group, or even like a one-on-one, like we had talked about earlier, a one-on-one relationship, there's always something good. There's always something of value, because we don't join something unless we're being fed in some important way. We don't stay if we're not also getting something positive. And so in the process of healing, of taking our life back, there's this wonderful book by a colleague of mine, Janja Lalich, called Take Back Your Life. I love that phrase. And when you're taking your life back, it can be, to me, is actually really important to also own and acknowledge the good that was there. Because if we focus on just the negativity, we run a greater risk of actually doing what we call cult hopping, of saying, oh, that's so bad. That group is so bad. I'm done with that. We're actually staying in an either or kind of mentality.
so I got to find a different cult
So
to get that will actually work,
right.
But you're not consciously again, but
It's actually a mindset, and the mindset has to do with black and white thinking, either or, good and bad, where that's an essential part of creating cultic dependence. So if you get out of a cultic group or a cultic relationship, and you continue with that same mindset, you're more likely to still be struggling, to either want to maybe isolate. There can be a huge amount of shame about the lived experience of coming out of a group. And that's something that I'm super passionate about. We didn't mention I Got Out yet, the hashtag project that I'm a founding member of. But hashtag I Got Out is a project that has one mission, and that is to encourage people to tell their stories of cultic abuse. So in the same way that we saw hashtag Me Too and bringing those stories of sexual harassment and sexual violation and abuse out into the light of day, awareness of those issues have been brought forward. So the hashtag I Got Out is a project that has already gained, like we just hit our 1-year anniversary a week and a half ago. And there's so many, many, many people that have already been helped through the simple power of telling our story, of claiming the good things about the group that we were involved in, of actually articulating the horror of what we've lived through. For some people, it can be decades of sitting on their experience. They were connected with the Moonies 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they haven't told their story. Many, many people today are what we call second generation cult survivors, and they're telling their story. So they grew up, they were born into a cultic group. And these what we call the second gens and third generation survivors are a powerful voice of healing and articulating, by articulating the lived experience, other people are being helped to get out of their environments that are no longer healthy. And our hope is that this is truly rippling out into the wider world. This is a worldwide movement. There are people. I had a woman in a writing class the other day for I Got Out. So just to back up one sec, I offer a free writing class for people who have experienced cultic abuse to write their hashtag I Got Out statement. So some people can just write it and get it out into social media and blast it, and that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Some people want a little support in doing that, and they can attend this Zoom class. I had a woman from Bali the other day. I've had people from Korea, from Australia. In fact, we're doing a new class for our Down Under friends so that they can actually attend because it's really hard with time zones. So people around the world are telling their stories, which I see as just a beautiful antidote to the rise of authoritarianism that we see globally today. That's the passion that I'm bringing to the world today. That's my hope. That's my, to me, they're actually, it's just, that work is just as important, if not more, than my book here, An Everyday Cult.
What an amazing way to turn your experience around in a way to be of service to others too.
Mm-hmm. It's an honor. It's the easiest, most beautiful, most fulfilling work I've ever done.
I bet. And so beyond that hashtag movement, you also work with people individually as a counselor or a coach for people who are trying to get out or have already gotten out of a cultic experience.
Yeah, I work as an educator. So not a coach.
Okay.
Coach is kind of a bad word in these days because there's so many coaches. There's a lot of self-help coaching that is actually has slid, unfortunately, into the cultic spheres. So I'm an educator. My focus is in cult recovery, and I can work with individuals one-on-one, or even with families, or with the group itself that might be struggling with some kind of power issues. So on any levels like that, and I will say that I have a specialty that I am just really, really loving right now, which is a writing class that's called Writing to Reckon. And that's an ongoing class for people who have experienced either spiritual abuse or cultic involvement in one, or power over abuse in whatever way. And for people who are serious about using writing as part of their healing process. So it's a class that I offer by Zoom, small group. It's always just 6 people or less in the group. And the power of writing, the power of articulating your lived experience. Dr. Dan Siegel calls it creating a coherent narrative. Do you know the work of Dan Siegel?
I don't.
Oh, he's awesome. I was very fortunate to stumble upon his work when I first got out, and it helped me enormously.
Is that what led to your book?
Ultimately, absolutely. Yes, my book is basically, it's a hashtag I Got Out statement in long form. Typically the statement is a couple paragraphs or maybe a couple pages, or for some people it's a poem or a series of slides. For me, the writing the book was, it was a 4-year process of writing it and another year of getting it out. And I am really proud of it. It's pretty amazing.
Well, the power of story.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where I think change can happen
Right.
and how we really learn.
And I was worried, Wendy, how it was going to be when I got this story out into the world.
Yeah.
Oh my God, am I going to just be so embarrassed? Like, what am I going to feel? And, it's like, I don't have anything to hide. I feel relieved to just have expressed my story.
That's very good news.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, especially since you had a question mark there, like, yeah, is this a good thing
Right.
or not? No, but I think when you're exploring and getting back to your truth, then it can't be a bad thing, right? It may not always be pretty, but
It ain't
it's
always pretty, that's for sure.
no,
I
it ain't always
guarantee
pretty,
that.
but it's important,
Yeah,
right? And that's how we grow. That's how we evolve. You got to accept that shit. I always say acceptance doesn't mean you have to like it.
we don't have to like it.
If anyone is interested in connecting with you, maybe joining this writing group that you have, how would they find you?
I have a website, GeretteBuglion.com. My name, Gerette, my last name, Buglion, Buglion.com.
Well, Gerette, wow, what a story you have. And I'm really appreciative of you coming on and sharing a lot of it with me and with the folks who may be listening. That was a stupid thing to say. They're kind of listening, but not really.
And all those ones who maybe sort of are. Right.
Yeah. You know what I mean.
I do. We do. They do too. They know too.
Oh, but thank you so very much. I feel like we could probably talk for another 5 hours.
I think so too, Wendy. I really appreciate talking with you.
Gerette's story is more than a little disturbing, don't you think? Listening to her recount her experience, I couldn't help but think about how the martial arts school I belonged to back in the 90s and some of the shamanic trainings I went to were on the edge of being cult-like. If Gerette's story brought up some questions or concerns for you, I hope you'll reach out to her. If you'd like to learn more about her work or purchase a copy of her memoir, please visit her website. I've included a link in the show notes. I've also included a link to the #IGotOut website in the show notes as well. Gerette also has a podcast called Everyday Cults, Everyday People. All right. Thank you so much for listening and for supporting the podcast in whatever way you can, by giving it a positive review, letting others know about the show, making a donation, or by checking out the offerings at the Lucid Path Etsy shop. Until next time.